The final sound was not a slam of anger but the quiet, oiled click of a heavy lock engaging its bolt, a sound of profound and indifferent finality. It was the noise a well-maintained mechanism makes when it performs its function perfectly, and its function, in this case, was to separate the world of what was from the world of what would now be. Elara stood on the worn stone steps of the Wardship of Saint Jude, a place that had been her container for 18 years, and felt the last thread to its sterile security sever. The air, thick with the damp chill of late autumn and the smell of wet pavement and distant coal smoke, felt impossibly vast, a sudden, crushing emptiness where the predictable walls and regulated hours had been. She was, by the decree of the state and the turning of the calendar, an adult. The word tasted like ash in her mouth, a bitter fraud. It meant only that she was no longer their problem, a file to be stamped, closed, and shelved in a dusty archive of other solved cases. The world had not opened up to her. She had been ejected into it, a fledgling pushed from a nest that was not built of love, but of bureaucratic necessity. Before the great oak door had clicked shut, a tired man in a frayed suit, his face a roadmap of institutional fatigue, had pressed a thin manila envelope into her hand. It was the sum total of her connection to the past and her provision for the future. Inside, she found not a letter of farewell or a word of encouragement, but the cold, hard facts of her new existence. There was a brittle, yellow deed, folded into a tight square, its creases threatening to disintegrate into dust. It granted her ownership of a property known only as Alistair's Folly, on a place called Greyfell Peak, a name that sounded like a cough. There was a sum of money, $112 in worn, soft bills that felt inadequate and insulting. And finally, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth, there was a single, heavy key. It was made of pitted black iron, its shaft thick and its teeth crudely cut, more a relic than a tool. The man had offered a dry, mirthless smile as he handed it over. "Your great-grandfather's legacy," he had announced, the words carrying the weight of a long-standing, amusing joke. A madman who thought he could build a castle in the sky. It's likely nothing but a pile of rocks, but the state has fulfilled its obligation. The obligation felt less like a duty performed and more like a final, subtle cruelty, a parting gift of worthless hope tied to a cursed piece of land. She clutched the envelope, the sharp corners of the deed pressing into her palm, the dead weight of the key a cold promise in her pocket. The journey north was a descent into a progressively harsher reality. It began on a rattling bus that smelled of diesel fumes and damp wool, its windows weeping with condensation that blurred the passing world into a smear of gray and brown. Towns dwindled into villages, which in turn gave way to isolated farmhouses huddling against the encroaching wilderness. The gentle, rolling hills of her memory steepened into jagged, stony inclines, their faces scarred by shadow and dusted with the first intimations of a long, hard winter. The passengers thinned until she was the only one left, a silent figure in a worn coat, watching the landscape grow more desolate with each mile. The bus finally wheezed to a halt at a crossroads marked only by a leaning wooden signpost pointing toward Oakhaven in one direction and an unmarked, ascending track in the other. "This is as far as I go," the driver had mumbled, not quite meeting her eye, as if she were a ghost he was tasked with delivering to her haunting ground. From there, the journey became a pilgrimage on foot. She shouldered her single, meager bag and began the long walk up the mountain track. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. The wind, a playful breeze in the lowlands, became a persistent, searching adversary, pulling at her coat, stinging her cheeks, and whispering empty promises of failure in her ears. The world shrank to the crunch of her boots on the gravel path and the rhythmic burn in her thighs, a lonely planet of one moving through an indifferent cosmos of rock and sky. When she finally crested the last rise, the sight that greeted her shattered the last, fragile sliver of hope she had unknowingly harbored. The name, Alistair's Folly, was not a judgment. It was a simple, brutal description. There was no house. There was no cabin. There was only a ruin, a skeleton of a structure silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. Great, blackened timbers clawed at the air like the ribs of a desiccated carcass, their strength long since surrendered to rot and weather. A single, monumental stone chimney stood defiantly apart from the wreckage, listing to one side like a broken tooth, its mortar crumbling, its very presence an accusation. A section of the foundation wall remained, a low crescent of moss-covered stone that seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth from which it was hewn. Near the base of the chimney, a collection of weathered timbers and collapsed planking covered what might have once been a cellar or, as a more ominous thought suggested, the boarded-up entrance to a mine. The wind was the true occupant of this place. It was no longer just a current of air, but a living, predatory entity. It howled through the gaps in the broken timbers, a mournful, hungry sound. It swirled around the base of the stone chimney, plucking at loose stones and whispering of decay. It was the voice of the mountain, and it spoke a language of utter desolation. This was her inheritance, not a shelter, but a grave marker. For 3 days, despair was a physical state, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Elara found the most sheltered part of the ruin, a corner where 2 sections of the low stone wall met, creating a nook that broke the relentless assault of the wind. Here, she huddled, drawing her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. She built a fire, a pathetic, sputtering thing that consumed the precious, splintered which she scavenged from the wreckage at an alarming rate. It offered little comfort, its meager light pushing back the encroaching darkness by mere inches, its warmth a fleeting kiss that was instantly stolen by the cold. The smoke, rather than rising, was snatched and torn apart by the wind, a visible representation of her own dissipating hope. Her resources were a cruel joke. The small loaf of bread, the cheese, the handful of apples, they dwindled with each joyless, mechanical meal. The cold was not just an absence of heat. It was a presence, a solid thing that seeped through her coat, through her skin, and into the marrow of her bones. It was in the air she breathed, a sharp, crystalline pain in her lungs. Surrender became a seductive thought, a gentle whisper beneath the howl of the wind. It would be so easy to simply stop, to let the fire go out, to lie down, to close her eyes and let the cold, white silence take her. It felt less like dying and more like an overdue cessation of struggle, a final, peaceful merging with the vast, uncaring indifference of the mountain. On the 4th day, the spell of paralysis was broken. It was not a conscious decision, not a triumph of will over despair. It was a small, external observation that pierced the gray fog of her misery. Huddled in her stone corner, shivering, she watched a stray dog approach. It was a skeletal creature, its ribs a stark washboard beneath a coat of matted fur, one ear torn. It moved with a cautious, limping gait, drawn perhaps by the scent of her meager fire. It stopped a few feet away, its head low, expecting a blow or a shout. It offered a tentative, hopeful thump of its tail. Elara did nothing. She simply watched as the dog, after a long moment, crept closer and curled up just beyond the reach of her feet, not demanding anything, but offering a silent, desperate companionship. It closed its eyes and let out a shuddering sigh, and in that moment, something within her shifted. The profound, undeserved trust in the animal's posture, its absolute vulnerability, was an accusation against her own surrender. It was fighting to live, even in this broken state. And as she looked from the dog to the ruin, to the vast, oppressive sky, the sorrow that had filled her to the brim did not drain away. It flashboiled into a hot, clean, clarifying rage. It was a fury directed at the faceless bureaucracy that had discarded her, at the smirking man with his talk of folly, at the relentless wind that sought to scour her from the earth, and most of all, at the pathetic, whimpering creature she had allowed herself to become. She would not be a sad story whispered in a forgotten file. She would not be a pile of bones for the spring thaw to reveal. She would fight. The rage demanded an outlet, a physical expression that could match its intensity. Words were useless. Thoughts were a trap. She needed the catharsis of labor. She stood up, her stiff limbs protesting, and grabbed the sturdiest looking of the fallen timbers. Her first act of agency was not one of creation, but of raw, brute force ordering. She began to clear the debris from the area within the foundation walls. It was mindless, grueling work. She hauled splintered planks, their surfaces slick with damp rot, and threw them into a growing pile for firewood. She lifted and rolled stones, her untrained muscles screaming in protest, her palms scraping raw against their rough, gritty surfaces. The physical pain was a welcome anesthetic, a sharp, real sensation that drowned out the dull, persistent ache of hopelessness. Sweat dripped into her eyes, mingling with the grime on her face. She worked without a plan, driven only by the need to impose a small patch of human order on the overwhelming chaos of the ruin. Each stone moved, each plank cleared, was a small victory, a defiant shout against the mountain's indifference. She was not rebuilding a home. She was quieting the storm in her own mind by wrestling with the wreckage outside of it. The wind still howled, but now, she had a rhythm to work against it, the scrape of stone and the thud of wood her percussive answer to its mournful song. The shovel was a crude tool she had fashioned from a flat piece of rusted metal and a sturdy branch, but it served its purpose. While clearing the thick layer of rubble and earth that had accumulated at the base of the great stone chimney, it struck something that was not stone. The sound was not the sharp clink of metal on rock, but a dull, resonant thump that vibrated up the handle and into her arms. It was the sound of something hollow. A surge of adrenaline, born of curiosity and a desperate flicker of hope, erased her fatigue. She dropped to her knees and began to dig with her bare, scraped hands, tearing at the dirt and smaller stones with a frantic energy. The outline began to emerge from the packed earth, dark, iron-strapped wood. It was a box, a heavy sea chest or trunk, buried deep as if by deliberate design. It was large, at least 4 feet long, its surface pitted and scarred by its long interment, but miraculously intact. A heavy, rusted lock plate was bolted to its front, the keyhole a dark, gaping mouth. For a moment, she just stared at it, her breath misting in the cold air. Then, with a fumbling haste, she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, closed around the heavy, antique key, the key from the envelope. The relic. With trembling hands, she slid it into the lock. It was stiff, grinding with the protest of long-disused metal, but it fit. She put both hands on its crude head and turned. With a grating shriek that seemed to tear the silence, the lock mechanism turned over, and the chest was open. The air that rose from the open chest was cool and dry, smelling of oilcloth, old leather, and paper. Inside, swaddled in layers of waxed canvas, lay the true legacy of Alastair, her great-grandfather. There was no gold, no jewels, only the treasure of a brilliant mind. At the top lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with an elegant, dense script that flowed across the vellum. Beneath it, rolled and tied with twine, were dozens of schematics and diagrams, drawn with the precise hand of an engineer. As Elara sat in the cold, the wind whipping her hair across her face, she began to read. Alastair was not a madman. He was a physicist, an engineer, a visionary who had come to this mountain not to build a castle in the sky, but to conduct a radical experiment in living. The journal spoke of thermodynamics, of thermal mass, of convection, and of the Earth's own latent energy. He called the conventional stove a ravenous beast, a frantic, inefficient consumer of fuel that fought a losing battle against the cold. His solution was elegant, patient, and worked in harmony with nature, not against it. The schematics detailed his invention, the Ethelberg system. It was a high-mass masonry stove, a cachalophin, built into the very heart of the structure, its intricate flue paths designed to extract every last calorie of heat from the smoke before it escaped. But this was only half of the design. The true genius was its integration with the adjacent mine shaft. The plans showed a passive geothermal loop, a system of sealed pipes that would draw the cold air from the dwelling, circulate it deep into the mine where the earth maintained a constant, year-round temperature, and return it, warmed by the mountain itself, back into the base of the stove to be further heated and circulated. The stove was not a heater, it was a thermal battery. The mountain was not an adversary, it was a partner. The journal was more than a set of instructions, it was a conversation across time. Alastair's voice, full of passion and frustration, rose from the pages. He wrote of the mockery he faced, of being called a fool for building with stone instead of wood, for digging when he should be chopping. They see the cold as an enemy to be assaulted with fire, he wrote one evening, the ink slightly blurred as if by a sudden gust of wind. They cannot comprehend that the cold is merely an absence, and the greatest defense is not a frantic attack, but the patient, deliberate storage of warmth. My house will not burn bright. It will glow. It will hold the memory of a single fire for days, breathing it back into the stone, into the very air. They are building forts for a battle. I am building a vessel to ride out the storm. As Elara read, a new plan began to form, supplanting the formless rage and the desperate scramble for survival. The ruin was not a failure. It was an unfinished masterpiece. The listing chimney was not a broken tooth. It was the anchor, the central pillar of the entire system. Her purpose was no longer simply to endure the winter. It was to complete her great-grandfather's work. She would not rebuild the flimsy wooden structure that had rotted away. She would inhabit the stone heart of the ruin, the semi-subterranean fortress Alistair had designed. Her plan was audacious. It was exhausting to even contemplate, and it flew in the face of every piece of conventional wisdom. It was perfect. The dog, who had been watching her with intelligent eyes, nudged his head under her hand and whined softly, as if in agreement. She would call him Alistair. The journey to Oakhaven was a different ordeal than the first. The physical hardship was the same, the long walk, the biting wind, but her internal state was transformed. She was no longer a victim drifting toward her fate, but an agent with a clear, defiant purpose. She walked into the small town's single muddy street looking like an apparition from the wilderness. Her face was gaunt and smudged with soot and stone dust. Her hands were a mess of cuts and calluses, and her clothes were torn and stained. But her eyes, which had been dull with despair, now held a focused, unnerving intensity. People stopped and stared. The murmurs that followed her were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was the girl who had gone up to the folly, the one they had all assumed was already dead. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the faded sign of the town's general store. Croft and Thorne Mercantile, the bell above the door jingled, announcing her entrance into a world of wood smoke, leather, and the sharp tang of metal. Several men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their conversation halting as they turned to look at her. One of them, a large man with a florid face and a booming voice that filled the room, pushed himself to his feet. This was Silas Croft, a town councilman and the senior partner of the store, a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit. Elara walked to the counter and placed her list upon it. It was a strange list for this place. Firebricks, refractory mortar, cast-iron dampers, a specific gauge of flue pipe, and several rolls of sheet metal. Croft picked it up, his lip curling into a sneer as he read. He let out a loud, braying laugh that made the other men chuckle nervously. Well, he boomed, holding the list up for all to see. It seems the apple doesn't fall far from the loony tree. This is Alistair's madness all over again. He leaned over the counter, his voice dripping with condescending pity. Listen, girl, you can't build a house out of mud and pipe. You're chasing a ghost. What you need is lumber, a good iron stove, and about 10 cords of seasoned oak if you want to see the spring. You'll freeze to death up there playing with your great-granddaddy's toys before the first real snow. Take my advice, come down from that cursed rock, and we'll find you a room somewhere. His words were meant to be a crushing blow, the voice of reason extinguishing a foolish dream. But for Elara, they were fuel. Each mocking syllable, each condescending pronouncement, only served to harden her resolve, tempering it from hot rage into cold, unbreakable steel. She met his gaze and spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. What is the price for these items? The total, when tallied by a younger clerk under Croft's dismissive gaze, was far more than the worn bills in her pocket. The $112 that had seemed like such a meager shield against the world was utterly insufficient for the task of building its salvation. A wave of cold dread washed over her, more chilling than the mountain wind. This was it, the final, insurmountable obstacle. She had the knowledge, she had the will, but she lacked the coin. She was about to turn away, the fire in her eyes dimming, when another man stepped forward from the shadows at the back of the store. He was older, thinner than Croft, with a quiet, watchful demeanor. This was Elias Thorne, the store's other partner. He had been observing the entire exchange in silence, his eyes fixed not on her ragged appearance, but on the determined set of her jaw. He took the list from Croft's hand and studied it, then looked at Elara. It's a fool's gamble, he said, his voice a low rumble, not unkindly. The whole town knows what happened to Alistair. He died broke and heartbroken. He paused, looking at her calloused, dirty hands. But I also see a look in your eye I haven't seen in a long time. It's not madness. It's grit. He turned to the clerk. Give her the materials. Put it on an account, Croft sputtered, outraged. On credit? To her? She's good for nothing. Thorne silenced him with a quiet, steady glare. I'll cover it myself, Silas. Consider it a wager. A long shot. I'm betting on her grit against your hot air, this unexpected act of faith. This extension of credit that was not charity but a wager on her spirit was the first moment of external validation she had ever known. It was a lifeline. A profound, silent gratitude filled her. She could not speak it, so she simply nodded to Elias Thorne, a solemn promise passing between the old, skeptical benefactor and the young, determined outcast. The work that followed was a blur of methodical, exhausting labor. The journey back up the mountain, hauling the precious materials on a crude sledge she had built, was a monumental effort of will. Then came the construction. Following Alistair's intricate diagrams, she became a mason, an engineer, a smith. She dismantled the leaning chimney stone by stone, cleaning each one, learning its heft and shape. She rebuilt the firebox with the new firebricks, her hands raw from the abrasive refractory mortar. She painstakingly assembled the labyrinthine flue system within the massive core of the heater, each baffle and damper placed with geometric precision. The work was an education in patience and physics. It was a race against the calendar, against the deepening cold. The days grew shorter, the sun a pale, distant disk that offered little warmth. The wind was a constant companion, but now she barely heard it. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. The dog, Alistair, was her silent shadow, a warm presence at her back as she worked late into the fading light, his trust and unspoken encouragement. She reinforced the low stone walls, creating a single, snug, semi-subterranean room that wrapped around the immense stone mass of the Ethelberg heater. She fashioned a roof from salvaged timbers and layers of sheet metal, sealed with tar she bought on a second, quicker trip to town. Her woodpile remained shockingly small, a neat, almost comically modest stack of the driest which she had scavenged. It was not a stockpile for a war. It was the kindling for a single, sacred act of charging. Then the news came, carried on the wind, and in the worried conversations she overheard in Oakhaven. A storm was coming. Not just a blizzard, but a historic weather event, an atmospheric anomaly the forecasters had dubbed the White Hurricane. It was a confluence of Arctic air and oceanic moisture that promised unprecedented snowfall and temperatures that would plunge to lethal lows for days on end. The town of Oakhaven descended into a controlled frenzy. The steady drone of chainsaws filled the air from dawn till dusk as men worked to amass colossal mountains of firewood. Croft was at the center of it all, his voice booming in the mercantile, advising everyone to double their fuel stores, to seal their windows, to prepare for a siege. He championed the brute force methods he understood: bigger fires, more fuel, a direct and furious assault against the coming cold. His confidence was infectious, and the townspeople followed his lead, their preparations a noisy, frantic spectacle of fear and industry. They were battening down the hatches for a war with winter. Elara's preparations were a study in contrast. There was no frenzy, only a calm, methodical finality. She checked the seals on her dampers one last time. She ensured the airway from the mine shaft was clear. She brought her small, precious woodpile inside, stacking it neatly beside the heater's iron door. Her final act was the one her great-grandfather had described in his journal as the ignition, as the first flakes of snow, thick and heavy as down feathers, began to drift from a sky the color of lead. She built a fire. It was not a small, conservative fire, but a large, intensely hot blaze in the central firebox, using the best, driest wood. For 6 hours, she fed the flames, the roar inside the heater a contained inferno. The outer surface of the massive stone structure grew from cold, to cool, to neutral, and then, slowly, wonderfully, to a gentle, radiating warmth. She was not just heating the air. She was pouring thermal energy into 2 tons of stone and mortar, charging the great battery at the heart of her home. When the last log had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, she sealed the firebox and closed the main flue damper, trapping the immense reservoir of heat within the system's core. Then, she did nothing. She sat in a simple wooden chair, the dog Alistair asleep at her feet, and waited for the storm to break. The white hurricane did not arrive, it descended. The world outside her small shelter dissolved into a screaming vortex of white. The wind shrieked with a lunatic fury, a physical force that made the very mountain tremble. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain. In the town of Oakhaven, the battle began. The roar of the wind was matched by the roar of stoves being fed load after load of firewood. Silas Croft, in his large, well-built house, shoveled oak logs into his cast-iron stove, a confident smile on his face. But as the first day bled into the first night, the cold began to win. The conventional stoves, for all their roaring, were ravenous. They threw most of their heat straight up the chimney, demanding a constant, unsustainable tribute of fuel. The houses, even the well-built ones, began to bleed warmth. The temperature plummeted. By the second day, a grim reality set in. Stockpiles that were meant to last a week were half gone. The sound of chainsaws was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the howl of the storm and the ominous creak and groan of freezing timbers. Fear, cold and sharp, began to seep under the doorways. Croft's confidence curdled into angry frustration as his own massive woodpile dwindled at an alarming rate. His house became an icebox the moment the fire was not being furiously stoked. In a neighbor's home, a pipe burst with a sound like a gunshot, spewing water that froze instantly into a grotesque sculpture of ice. The town was losing its war. In the small stone shelter on Greyfell Peak, there was only a profound and absolute silence. The shrieking of the wind was a distant, muted thing, the rage of a predator locked outside a fortress. There was no fire, no crackle of burning logs, no frantic stoking. There was only warmth, a deep, gentle, radiant warmth that emanated from the immense stone mass of the Ethelberg heater. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a conventional stove, but a soft, pervasive comfort that filled every corner of the small room. The stone walls were warm to the touch. The very air felt dense with heat. Elara sat in her chair, reading Alistair's journal by the steady, clean light of an oil lamp. The dog slept on, his flank rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect contentment. She brewed tea on a small cast-iron plate set into the top of the heater, the water steaming in the cozy air. Outside, the world was being torn apart by a maelstrom of ice and wind, a lethal, elemental chaos. Inside, there was peace. There was security. There was an abundance of warmth drawn from a single, 6-hour fire and the patient, steady breath of the mountain itself. Her great-grandfather's folly was a sanctuary. It was a masterpiece of quiet, elegant triumph. The system worked. After 4 days, the hurricane blew itself out. The wind died down to a whisper, and a weak, watery sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a world transformed. Elara pushed open her door against a drift of snow and stepped out into a landscape of impossible beauty and profound silence. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The ruined timbers of the old structure were soft, rounded sculptures. The very air was crystalline, scrubbed clean by the storm. Her shelter, a low mound of stone and snow, was an island of life in the frozen expanse. The tall chimney pipe puffed a faint, almost invisible plume of heat into the frigid air, the only sign of the immense warmth stored within. The snow had melted away from the base of her foundation walls, creating a dark, damp circle of exposed earth in the otherwise unbroken white, a testament to the heat bleeding slowly from her stone haven into the ground itself. She took a deep breath of the clean, sharp air, a feeling of quiet, unassailable victory settling deep in her bones. In Oakhaven, the survivors emerged from their frozen houses like ghosts. The town was devastated. The cold had been a merciless invader, leaving behind a trail of burst pipes, ruined pantries, and frostbitten limbs. The great woodpiles were gone, reduced to scattered chips and bark. A grim accounting began, and with it, a dawning, terrifying realization of how close they had all come to perishing. Amid the despair, a sense of duty stirred. Elias Thorne, his own store damaged but his spirit intact, organized a party to go up the mountain. It was a recovery mission. No one believed the girl could have survived. It was impossible. Silas Croft, his face gray with fatigue and humiliation, his own home a wreck, was shamed into joining them. They strapped on snowshoes and began the long, arduous trek up the buried track, a grim procession moving through a world of blinding white. As they neared the ruin, they fell silent, expecting to find nothing but a deeper drift of snow where the shelter had been. Then Elias stopped, pointing. Look, a faint shimmer distorted the air above a metal pipe sticking out of the snow. A heat haze. As they drew closer, they saw the other impossible thing. The dark, wet circle of melted snow around the base of the structure. It was a sign of life, so contrary to all logic that it felt like a hallucination. They reached the door, a low, sturdy plank construction half buried in a drift. Bracing themselves for what they would find, for the rush of frigid air and the grim discovery of a frozen body, two of the men put their shoulders to it and pushed. The door swung inward, and they were hit not by a wave of cold, but by a wall of warmth. It was a soft, gentle, radiant heat that flowed out of the dark interior and washed over their chilled faces, a physical shock of comfort so profound it felt magical. They stood frozen in the doorway, peering into the dim light. And they saw her. Elara was sitting at a small table, a steaming mug in her hands, the dog Alistair lifting his head from her feet with a lazy thump of his tail. She was not just alive. She was not just surviving. She was warm, healthy, and calm, her shelter a small pocket of impossible spring in the heart of the frozen winter. Croft pushed his way to the front, his face a mask of disbelief. He stared from her comfortable, peaceful state to the tiny, depleted woodpile inside the door. His mind, locked in the logic of brute force, could not process the scene. How? He stammered, the word a raw croak of incomprehension. Where is all the wood? How is it warm? Elara looked up at him, her gaze clear and steady. She gestured to the great stone mass that dominated the room. I don't fight the cold, she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stunned silence. I store the warmth. The mountain helps, in that simple explanation, in the undeniable reality of the scene before them. Silas Croft's entire worldview, his authority, his blustering self-assurance, evaporated. The other men looked from the comfortable girl to the disgraced councilman, and the last vestiges of his public respect turned to ridicule. He had led them in a loud, foolish war, while she had quietly, intelligently, made peace. The story of the girl who had tamed the white hurricane swept through the recovering town like a wildfire. Elara's status was inverted overnight. She was no longer the outcast prodigy, the mad girl on the cursed peak. She was a figure of awe and respect, the woman who held the key to surviving the mountain's wrath. The narrative had changed. Alistair's folly was no longer a place of failure, but a place of pilgrimage. At first, they came to gawk, to see the miracle for themselves. But soon, they began to come with a different purpose. They came to learn. A farmer whose family had nearly frozen asked if she would look at his plans for a new barn. A young couple, wanting to build a home, came with notebooks and questions. Elara, who had been cast out and left to die, became a teacher. She unrolled her great-grandfather's schematics on her small table, the vellum worn smooth by her own hands, and she shared his knowledge freely. She explained the principles of thermal mass, the elegant dance of heat and air, the partnership with the earth itself. She held nothing back. The wisdom that had been dismissed as madness was now the town's most precious commodity. Silas Croft, unable to bear the daily, silent humiliation of her triumph, sold his share of the mercantile to Elias Thorne for a pittance and left Oakhaven, disappearing into the wider world that had no memory of his arrogance. Years passed. The landscape of Oakhaven and the surrounding homesteads began to change. The transformation was slow, built of stone and mortar, but it was profound. New homes were built with a distinctive, massive stone core. Older houses were retrofitted, their inefficient iron stoves replaced by the elegant, patient mass of Ethelberg heaters. The annual rhythm of the town shifted. The frantic, forest-devouring rush to stockpile would before winter was replaced by a more thoughtful, communal period of maintenance and preparation. The annual charging of the heaters became a ritual, A day in late autumn when a sweet-smelling wood smoke would rise from the chimneys all across the valley for a few hours before disappearing, leaving the homes charged with warmth for the cold days to come. The town lost its fear of the winter. The mountain was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a partner in survival. Elara remained on Greyfell Peak, her shelter now a comfortable, expanded home, a beacon of warmth and wisdom. She never married, but she was never alone. She became a matriarch to the entire community, a living legend with stone dust under her fingernails and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst and had not only survived, but thrived. Young apprentices came to live and work with her, learning the lost arts of thermal engineering and patient construction. She taught them that true strength was not in the frantic, loud assault, but in the quiet, intelligent storage of energy. She showed them that true resilience came from working with the forces of nature, not in waging a futile war against them. Her life was a testament to a simple, profound truth, that the greatest value is often hidden in the very things a loud, arrogant world has dismissed as worthless, and the most powerful wisdom is not shouted from the rooftops, but discovered in silence and earned through grit.